Hello, and welcome to ReCAP, Per Capita's research and policy podcast, where we examine inequality and unpack our latest work in our fight for a fairer Australia. We're coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, whose lands were never ceded, and pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and to the elders of the lands on which you may be listening to this today. I'm your host, Emma Dawson, and this week we're joined by my good friend, co-founder and co-CEO of Gender Lens Australia, Tanja Kovac. We're going to continue our dissection of Per Capita's new report, The Way In 2024, which is the third report in a series examining the backgrounds of elected members of federal parliament, and it follows our analysis of the 45th and 46th parliament too. Now, it was recently the 30th anniversary of Labor's gender quotas, which were announced at the ALP's 1994 National Conference. And in this study, we found that this Albanese Labor government is indeed the first in Australia's history to form a federal government with a gender composition that reflects society. 52% of this government were women at the opening of the 47th Parliament. As the winner of the Emily's List Award for her long commitment to achieving gender equality in the Labor Party in 2015, there's no one better to take us through the history of the party's acceptance of affirmative action and why the fact that the Albanese government is the first in history to achieve gender parity is so important. Tanja, of course, was a leader of Emily's List for over a decade, including the critical time of our first female Prime Minister, Julia Gillard. I'm so glad you're with us today, Tan. Thanks for coming along.
Great to be here, Emma, talking about my favourite topic.
Absolutely, and one to and you know this is a result that's received some attention, that we've got there to the 50%, but not enough in my view. And given your long involvement, your long history, take us through how it came about and a little bit about your involvement there too.
Well, I think it's really only natural, isn't it, that women voters, want to see themselves in their parliaments.
Yeah.
And when you can't see yourself, and it's not just around gender, when you can't see yourself, there's a really high risk that those parliaments are not making laws and making policies in your best interest. There
Mm.
is, whether it's conscious or unconscious, there is a bias there. There's a groupthink that evolves, and and over time we have seen, because of that strategy of Labor's to adopt a gender quota. It was a brave and bold decision to do it 30 years ago, and each time that the quota has lifted, because it wasn't immediately 50%, as you know, it started off at 35% and incrementally increased over time. Each time we have seen the strength of women's representation within the Labor seats of Parliament improve. And that has had a huge impact on the policies. And that's why you do it. It's had a
Mm.
huge impact on the policies and the laws and what they have meant for Australian women. We would not have decriminalised abortion in Australia without the work of Labor's gender quota. We would not have that. We
Mm.
would not have the investment levels or the focus on gendered violence that we currently have. There is no doubt in my mind that we would still be treating domestic violence as a private matter that shouldn't be uttered publicly if it wasn't for the numbers of women that are now on Labor's front bench. And it's the same for the paid parental leave, childcare, and the care economy. All of these work. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I think you and I have talked many times, though, that we're still far away from there being gender parity in this country. The Labor movement has more than done its heavy lifting. We're still far away from the total parliament
Mm.
being gender equal.
Mm.
Um, but and that's the same across most of the Western world. But despite that, we've made these huge gains, and we're already starting to see backlash,
Yep.
and that really troubles me. And even as recently as the Queensland election, we now are seeing a number of pro-choice Labor women losing their seats, and you have an anti-choice candidate in the Katter Party
Mm.
putting back on the table the recriminalisation of reproductive rights. And this is the reason Labor adopted the quota was to have change, and the reason we need to maintain gender equity is because our gains are not always certain and certainly not forever.
No, absolutely. And then that's why the work, the ongoing work of yourself and others in the party and the Labor movement more broadly is so important. I think, we're both comfortably middle aged now, Tan, but when when you talk to young women about the fact that it's the 30th anniversary of the initial commitment, and we've just got there in the last couple of years, they're really quite shocked by that. 30 years seems like, it is a lifetime for many of them. But as you've just said, we've seen in Queensland and in South Australia recently, driven by the sort of right wing of the Liberal Party over there, this very American style push to regain control over women's bodies. So it's an eternal struggle. And it's not that the achievement in the ALP wasn't one without quite a fight.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there was a time when there were voices of dissent to the idea of quotas on the Labor conference floor.
Yeah.
Um, by the time, and I'm pleased about this, by the time of that final vote, and I was present, I was there to lift it from 40% to 50%. It was totally unanimous. There were no voters against it. There were no speakers against it. Change had been done so deeply
Yeah.
and authentically over time that it meant that it was sticky. And I see, I think, as a young person, I probably thought that gender equality was something that would happen
Yeah.
super quick, and I'd be a great beneficiary of it.
Mm.
But what I realize now is that there is beauty in the persistent incrementalism of change.
Yeah.
And this is an intergenerational project. When I had my chance over 10 years to hold the baton that was given to me by the late Joan Kerner and Kay Setchers and Leonie Morgan and others, when that baton was passed to me, it was my time to be able to do as much as I could with it. And as I handed that baton over to the next generation of advocates in Emily's List Australia and the Labor Women's Network, it is time for there to be continued vigilance. And so I'm excited actually by the Labor movement's modelling of intergenerational policy change.
Yeah.
It's sometimes things don't happen quickly. They have to be done beautifully, incrementally,
Mm.
in order to ward off backlash and resistance.
Yep. Yeah, that's so important, and it's a theme of all the work we do at Per Capita too. Is we're idealists, right? But we're also pragmatists. We know what it takes to make change that lasts and that sticks and that is embraced. And I think one of the really telling things about the last election, not only that the Labor Party and thus the government achieved gender parity, the opposition parties went backwards because they lost so many seats to professional women that many of whom a generation ago you would have thought would have been pre-selected for Liberal Party candidature, particularly in New South Wales. And those women were simply saying it's not acceptable anymore. It's simply not okay for you to ignore half the population and actively um, counter their representation as the previous Prime Minister did, Scott Morrison in particular. I think when he said on International Women's Day a few years ago, "Well, we want to see women do well, but not at the expense of anyone else." There was a large kind of intake of breath by a lot of those professional women who might traditionally have supported the Liberal Party. So that gender and again, sorry, but we see what's happening in the US election, right? And where Kamala Harris has a lead amongst young women of 67% young women voting for Kamala Harris to 27% of young men. And on the flip side, about 48% of young men are voting for Trump, as opposed to only about 28% of young women. So this gender divide is becoming a feature of our policy debate and our political debate because women are simply not willing to accept anything less than full representation anymore.
Well, I have been talking about gender based campaigning
Mm.
and its alignment progressive-based campaigning for a long time,
Yeah.
and before me, people like Professor George Lakoff, cognitive linguist and political debate framer, has talked about the alignment between gender and the differences between conservative and progressive framing.
Mm.
I think there's even within the Labor Party itself, I still think there is some nervousness
Yeah.
and also a lack of awareness and skill in how um, to utilize what the data is telling us. I mean, how can you ignore the best data that I do like to go to the Australian electoral studies research at the end of each election. It is now, 30 years old and very reliable and consistent. How can you ignore that there is something like a 20 to 30% gap between women and men's attitudes to how dire they think something like climate change
Mm.
is?
Mm.
Now, if you look at that data, it is completely clear that the rise of the teals was going to happen if
Yeah.
they are putting a climate lens over conversations in what were predominantly Liberal seats.
Mm.
They were making a gender-based appeal to women who wanted to vote for that issue in a very different way to men.
Mm.
And I think, I'm interested in thinking about what we need to learn as a Labor movement about. We've obviously done a fantastic job of getting women to sit on the seats. What more do we now need to do to learn how to use our knowledge and our expertise in gender-based campaigning to get elected, to now talk about gender-based campaigning to influence and
Mm.
shape electoral results in different ways?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's I think going to be it's so important to the work we do at Per Capita, which when I started was the only female-led think tank in the country, and we remain at the moment we are 100% female staffed, and of course you as a
Amazing.
yeah, yeah.
Oh,
And with an age range of sort of, mid-20s up to mid-70s as well. We do automatically apply that gender lens because we're women, but having learned from you and Marie, the sort of structural approach to putting a gender lens on our work, was what led me to really understand a couple of years ago, and this comes to what's the next policy challenge, that the entire economy, the structure of our economy is completely and utterly sexist. That it is entirely created, the modern sort of market economy, particularly the economically rationalist or neoliberal or whatever kind of label you want to put on the last 30 to 40 years in particular, just assumes there's a wife at home doing all of the unpaid work, unpaid care. And the challenge that we see now, as this Labor government, under Katie Gallagher in particular, as Minister for Finance and Minister for Women, fantastic combination, is pushing this shift on women's economic security and investing in lifting the wages of care workers. They made an announcement today they're going to fund programs to get women into more male-dominated jobs, a lot of the trades and so on that will come with the shift to renewables. That doing that work is really the next big battle to make people understand a lot of these assumptions we make about an economy are damaging to women. They don't support women's full participation. And more than that, they actually actively encourage women to maintain a proportionate share of unrecognised, unvalued work.
I mean, this project is not just relevant to Australia. We have a global GDP
Yeah,
is based on, I think, two significant lies. One, that there's no value in care work and the
yeah,
care work that takes place in a home,
yeah,
and that there's really no value in the environment, in our sustainable earth.
yeah.
They're not lies, they're mistakes.
That's
And
right.
it's becoming it's women's responsibility to correct both of them.
Mm,
That's why we want to vote so much to protect our earth,
mm,
because we understand that we have the earth has been excluded as we have in considering what is of value.
mm.
And I see this issue is at coming to grips with this and how you communicate this with the community is a core part of what all progressive organisations need to do across the globe.
Yep.
But it will require a primacy of gender and a discussion about women to be in the prime. And there's some resistance around that still, Emma.
Just a
You
bit.
know, surprise. Um, but I'm kind of comforted about where resistance is going. Like I look at what's happened in the labour movement. Yes, there was resistance, and ultimately, once you saw how successful gender targets they just work,
Yeah.
because you see that they work, that resistance disappeared. Who would believe that the International Monetary Fund
Mm.
would ever have embraced gender targets or then become a champion of the concept of inclusive gender equal economies
Mm.
in order to promote growth? Who
Yeah.
would ever have thought that? But that's where we are.
Mm.
I think this is what's making the coalition look so very isolated and so very outdated,
Yeah.
because there are now so many organisations that and entities that have moved beyond the tired rhetoric that special measures are somehow inconsistent um, with growth, individualism, and capital. I mean, that's not no longer accurate.
No, I think, there's a reason that it's referred to as Mother Earth, right? That our biosphere, our ecology, the environment that we're doing so much damage to, is the very foundation of reproductive life. The Earth reproduces, it nurtures, it constantly corrects and repairs itself, and so it's the division, the very false and artificial creation of an economy that somehow sits above all that reproductive work, that reproductive work is invisible. Worse, it's unimportant. Worse, it's there to be exploited and to be pillaged. And by doing so, we're actually destroying the foundations of our world in every sense, whether that's the environmental damage we're doing, the social dislocation that's been caused by us losing sight of living in intergenerational families, of having a village of women that support us. These things are seen as somehow opposite to growth. They hold growth back, so they must be destroyed. And a gender lens doesn't allow us to do that. It recognizes actually there's never been a productive worker that can be productive without a full belly and a roof over their head and all of the things that come with the reproductive side of our existence.
And I think we also don't understand how fundamental those values are to
Mm.
how we choose to exercise a vote. And when you're talking
Yeah.
about communicating with disenfranchised and socially dislocated voters, reaching into those deeply held values, particularly about our families, how we want what we want to leave to our children. When we asked recently for Gender Lens Australia recently asked a group of women to explain why do you think there is such a difference in how women think about climate change and its gravity versus men? And without we knew what they were going to say, of course, because this is our work, but they naturally said because women are responsible for birthing children in the next generation. And so
Yeah.
when you have that responsibility, um, it is something that sharpens your mind about how you think about what you're going to leave moving forward. That
Mm.
opens up a really interesting dialogue that the labour movement and progressive movements across the whole world can have, not just with women, but with men too. And so
Mm.
it's starting to think about how do you use a gender lens to break through to conversations with strong, loving fathers who want futures that are beautiful for their children. How do you reach them? How do you communicate to them? And to a large extent, that is what focuses my work with Marie now in Gender Lens Australia. We're very much thinking about how do we take all sorts of organisations, whether they're government, but also business and the community sector, on a journey to thinking, putting a gender lens over most of what you do, so that you can find new ways to communicate with people and also refreshed solutions to some, tricky and difficult problems.
Yeah, I think it's so important that that's the approach that you take, you and Marie at Gender Lens Australia, to emphasise that putting a gender lens over public policy decisions is not about getting better outcomes for women. It's about getting better outcomes for everyone, for people of all genders. Because we know how, different policies affect people differently according to many intersecting characteristics, but gender's a big, big part of that, given the traditional patriarchal structures of the political and economic system we live in. So just let's just talk a little bit more about why and how, because of course there's still great resistance within parts of the Liberal and National parties towards quotas, although there are young women in Hilma's network and other places that are trying to push this for their party because they've seen that it actually works and there's nothing else that does. But certainly, and a nod here to the late great Stephen Ryan, who was a mentor for me and someone that really pushed gender equality onto the national agenda in the 1980s, first female cabinet minister in Australian history. But after those great first wave feminists of the 70s and 80s, this has been an ongoing task, as you say. It's an intergenerational project, and we wouldn't have achieved paid parental leave. We were only us in America in the developed world that didn't have government funded paid parental leave until it was introduced by the Gillard government, largely through the work of yourself and Emily's List and other people in the party. But it's taken us until this year to get superannuation paid on that paid parental leave. So we're constantly taking these incremental steps. And now we're seeing a lot of pushback against the investment the government's making in the care economy. So to the point where I seem to be spending half my time at the moment in the media arguing with male economists who say we can't afford to give early childhood educators a 15% pay rise because it might be inflationary. As though a living wage for people doing such important work threatens their share portfolio return.
I mean, I never imagined myself poring over the state and federal budgets. I
No.
never imagined that that would be part of my, work as a feminist.
Yeah.
But having spent time in government, and for that, I'm always very grateful for the late Fiona Richardson too,
Yes.
for giving me and for that matter that opportunity. Having spent time in government, it was so obvious that the question of how we invest and how much we invest, both the amount but also the decisions that we make about the amount,
Mm.
is is absolutely where the main game is around gender equality.
Yep.
So I'm really focused on gender responsive budgeting, um, make ensuring that um, we have feminist economists in positions of significance, and I have to applaud the Albanese government for having made some incredible appointments. Both of us have got relationships with Danielle Wood and also with Dr. Ange Jackson. I mean, these appointments are significant.
Mm.
Dr. Leonora Riss as well.
Yeah. We've got Michelle Bullock, the APA, and Gina Cass-Gottlieb, head of the ACCC, and she's not taking a backward step when it comes to large corporations either.
These things are
Yeah.
these appointments are massively important, and I totally agree with you that I think it's a massive game changer to have a minister for women and a minister for finance. Just having a woman in the finance
I know.
portfolio is a huge, huge issue to help to move the conversation along in ways that draws a connection between what I think traditionally, gender equality has been seen like a human rights issue, and for me, I see gender equality very much as an economic issue, and a leadership issue. It's not just a human rights issue in any way. And the way forward for progressive organisations is to embrace that learning. And what's happening for the coalition is they're really struggling with that, because to adopt that premise means unpicking a lot of their their other holy cows of of their political framing. Well, one thing I find really interesting, Emma, though, is I find that I'm really bemused about their opposition to quotas because they have a quota in order to hold the coalition together.
Yeah, that's
Without a quota, they would not they would not have a balance of seats between largely metropolitan Liberal candidates and MPs and largely regional and rural country
mm,
national candidates. So
yeah.
they're not really
No,
opposed to quotas, actually. It makes me think that that they do still have, and I think they have a woman problem, they have a gender problem.
mm,
It's not the
yeah,
quotas per
yeah.
se that are the problem.
Yeah, there's a deeply held view that goes along with their conservative economics positions, and their refusal, for example, to countenance anything to do with a well-being economy. Remember the previous Treasurer Josh Frydenberg mocking that in Parliament, suggesting it had something to do with prayer beads, or their willingness to, as I say, a lot of this pushback on the support for the care economy, and not just the coalition, but their cheerleaders in the conservative press, saying this is nonsense. It's a non-market sector. Why are we investing in a non-market sector of the economy? And oh, horror, horror! All the jobs growth coming from the public sector, and so it's deeply ingrained with their pro-market, which, as we know, is a patriarchal structure. That they're unable to sort of see beyond that, and I think that's why, smart, economically right-leaning women, but socially progressive women like Allegra Spender are really showing them up on that front. That she doesn't fundamentally disagree with their approach to the economy, except she can see, she knows how to put a gender lens on things, and so that's a real challenge for that party. Um, but it is, I think, it's something to celebrate. This first majority female government. We've got the highest number of female cabinet ministers in history. But as we've said, in really important positions, right? Finance minister, that is the role that says no to spending. And if you've got someone in that role, as we do now, that automatically understands how to put a gender lens on something, then a lot of the objections to spending will go away, because a lot of the classical objections to investing in social infrastructure are that it's not productive, it's reproductive. And I think, we've moved beyond that within the government itself, but there remain huge areas of our, economic and political life that are still dominated by that thinking. So having women in, like, the minister's the top of the tree when it comes to where the buck rests, right? So even if you've got an apparatus that's resistant to it.
Yeah, and I mean, that's why I spent 10 years of my life devoted to ensuring that we get women into positions where they can influence and have that authority.
Yeah.
But I'm also acutely aware that our treasuries in Australia and all across the world come from an academy that is trained
Yeah.
um, in a in what we've already identified is a flawed gendered perspective
Mm.
and a flawed environmental perspective of what is of value in an economic sense.
Yeah.
And as long as we don't see that bigger project and don't invest in that bigger project as progressives, we will still have trouble sustaining the change when we leave
Mm.
office.
Mm.
So um, I have already seen what happens on that front, because when you come in, as I had the experience of doing, when you come in as as staff to support a Labor government when it's new and fresh, you will inherit parts of the public sector that are still wanting to do things in a way that might be 30, 50, 100 years
Mm.
old, because that's what how they've been trained to do it all along.
Yeah.
And that's, the voice, ensuring that there are women in leadership who are taking up different perspectives, who are using that feminist economic lens and getting an opportunity to share those perspectives in the public sector, and is helps also change the culture within those organisations over the long term.
Yeah.
So I get excited about Katie. I get excited about Katie that being there, but I'm also focused around making sure that we do the structural changes while we have these positions,
Absolutely.
so that you protecting things like gender responsive budgeting,
Yeah.
putting it in legislation. I mean, that's what Victoria has done that. How good is that?
You're being really modest there because you and Fee, of course, were a big part of driving that and ensuring that
That's true.
our responsive state was a legislated commitment by the Andrews government early on. So thank you. And thank you, Fiona, for your work there as well. I mean, these things are, like you said at the outset, they're incremental changes that add up over time to a real structural change. And that's what we're achieving. But it's never fully achieved. We're there's a lot of resistance. Before we go, what are your reflections on how I alluded earlier on to that split that's occurring between male and female votes, particularly in the US. We're seeing a bit of it here as well. The backlash, as you said, it comes with every stride forward for gender equality. How are you feeling about the challenge of that next generation and ensuring that we don't slip backwards?
I think there is a very concerted effort across conservative forces of many different cultural backgrounds,
Mm,
to reassert an extreme, toxic form of patriarchy, capitalism, and fascism.
yep.
It is that we jokingly referred to it as, the tough guy syndrome.
Mm,
It's a bit more than that.
mm, mm,
Um, there is a programmatic piece of work going on, and the problem that I see enormously for women is that part of the that um, electoral appeal is putting women back in their
mm,
place.
mm. Yep.
And so our dialogues and our conversation with progressive men, and understanding why progressive men, why the men in our lives, and both of us have been privileged to have men in our lives close to us who support our gender equal leadership. Understanding why they do and some men don't needs to be a focus of some of our research, not just understanding the difference, it's understanding why and how we can improve those dialogues better. And I think, the interest in thinking about men's role in gendered violence comes from that space. But as we do that piece of work, I think it's still critical to recognise that the role that women have played in establishing the leadership to even have these difficult conversations. So, I welcome the moves towards thinking more about how we communicate with men, but I also value the role that we have now have as a progressive movement of having nurtured women's knowledge of how to talk well to men, deepening that and resourcing that better, you know? Yeah, I think work on that front too.
I think that's the important work that you're doing, and being willing when men are willing to say, "I've got this and I need help," to not dismiss that and to welcome them as allies and say, "Okay, ask me questions and we'll get there together." So I think the left traditionally the left has been unwilling to grapple with some of the misogyny in its ranks, or even where it's not misogyny, where it's that kind of we have to have the glorious revolution before we can turn our attention to feminism. We must overthrow the forces of capitalism, that kind of extreme left position, and sort of bringing the understanding that actually the point of putting a gender lens on the economy is to recognize that the patriarchal structure of it is the same thing you're fighting that we're fighting, right? It's the same assumptions that that lock men into very traditional, rigid pathways that tell them if they're not a hugely financially successful provider, then they've got no value. These are things that are ill-serving all of us and need to be tackled through that gender lens on behalf of us all. So, all power to you for the work that you're doing there, and thank you. Before we finish, I just want to reflect that it's 5 years now since we were working on our Measure for Measure Gender Equality in Australia report that you and I did, with Abigail Lewis, who was, with Per Capita back then. And a lot of what we were pushing for with that, we're seeing come through with this government. Um, and so thank you. I think that was really important, that taking that life course approach, to anyone who's not aware, go to our website and find Measure for Measure. It's still a very pertinent, relevant piece of work. Taking that life course approach where we looked at the points at which women fell behind in our system, and we also looked at those intersecting causes of oppression. But knowing that, we should probably redo that. It's been 5 years. It's time to look at what's changed, what's got worse, what's got better, and where we still need to concentrate, our efforts in that regard. But that was the time, that piece of work, and about 12 months later, or a few months after it came out, was that infamous coalition budget where Josh Frydenberg made a big announcement about women's support for women, and I worked out on budget night that it was worth 0.16% of the total budget, and it created this firestorm of anger amongst women. It became known as the sort of credible women movement, going, "Don't tell us this is good enough. It's not good enough." And so, I'm looking back at that now and thinking we've come a long way at a political level federally since then, but it would only take a change of government for a lot of that rhetoric to slip back in.
Oh, absolutely. And I get asked about Measure for Measure. I find myself going back to Measure for Measure
Mm,
regularly as well. I'm all up for an
yeah,
update. Uh, some of some I think we've had an enormous amount of impact with that document, despite the fact that it got launched just on the eve of COVID-19 too. Um, and it would definitely be fantastic to do a version of that that reflected on some of the gains and insights that we got around the care economy during
yeah,
COVID-19, because I think we definitely
yes,
did, and how that partly it catapulted us forward, but partly it also showed how sort of weak the gains were as well. It's definitely timely, but we I look at Em, I think we've both been around long enough to be able to go, there are many ticks and next to things that we've had an ambition for, and now it's time to think where to next. And that is certainly where I've putting my energy into the world, is where to next for gender equality. And I look forward to continuing that dialogue with you and with Per Capita, and seeing what future research your organisation produces that will be shaping the destiny of Australia.
Well, thank you, Tanya, and thank you for your wise counsel and your guidance over many years. I've certainly, learned a lot from you throughout our friendship, and really value what you contribute to our public life and what you contribute personally to the work we do at Per Capita. And I know we'll be doing more. So watch this space, those of you listening at home. That's all we've got time for today, but thanks so much for joining us, Tanya, and we will definitely have you back soon as we unpack some of the other work we're doing through a gender lens with the support and guidance of you and Marie.
Speak soon.
I'd like to thank Morris Blackburn Lawyers for sponsoring this season of ReCAP, and thank you, listener, for joining us for this episode. Don't forget, Per Capita Podcast has more shows for you to enjoy, including Burning Platforms, our big tech and politics podcast with Peter Lewis, Homes Not Houses, hosted by Matt Lloyd Cape, our John Cain Lunch series and webinars. So make sure you subscribe to Per Capita either on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. Or if you want to get all the latest news from us, we've got a newsletter, and you can join up for that at percapita.org.au. Join us again next time when we continue to examine inequality and work towards a fairer Australia. Bye bye.